I will be starting this section focused on the cultural norms, classroom implications, and tips based on the aspects of French language to use in the classroom. First, the general communication rules include the following: directness of speech, patterns of turns, changing topics, facial expressions, and hand signals. All of these are utilized and expressed in different ways from language to language, so it is important to recognize these differences when studying a language and its culture. Because French vocabulary and syntax tends to be more direct than English and some other languages, the French tend to speak in ways that get straight to the point. Avoiding topics or using soft language may cause miscommunication and confusion. Also related to the directness of the French language, when people are speaking with one another, it is common for them to have unfinished turns in which the first speaker does not finish their thought before the other speaker begins. This is not considered rude in most situations and is often seen as a display of understanding of the listener. Changing topics in French language tends to be depending on the terms of the relationship between the speakers, as well as how far into the conversation they are. For example, if they have just begun communicating, then changing topics is usually indicated by a slight but noticeable pause in order to ensure that they are both done speaking about the topic. As the conversation goes on, it is often found that this pause is often passed over and the individuals use direct language to indicate that they are speaking about something new. It is also dependent on the topic. If something is more sensitive, then the pauses may last longer or the people may address more aspects before moving on. If the people are familiar with one another, then they will most likely flow through the conversation easier and find less pauses when changing topics. The French do not typically use facial expressions when communicating. For example, smiling while speaking is not as common as it is for English speakers. Lastly, for the communication rules, it is important to be aware of the hand signals and gestures used while speaking. The French view this hand signal as zero or worthless, which is quite different than the English interpretation of okay. Nonverbal communication is another aspect that is important to consider when teaching native French speakers, as their practices are different from English speakers. Physical touch is typically only used in communication when individuals are familiar with one another because it is considered an act of affection. Similarly, with privacy, things like occupation, health, salary, and other personal subjects are only discussed with whom they have an established relationship, rather than with strangers. On the contrary, personal space is not seen as important. While they are private about other things, physical distance and personal space are not as strict. Lastly, eye contact is expected during conversation. It is a sign of courtesy and respect, as well as an indication that you are paying attention to the speaker. Nonverbal. Some cultural norms that are found in French include faire la bise, register, courtesy, punctuality, tone, and introductions. Faire la bise is a common greeting in which the speakers touch cheeks and kiss the air. The number of kisses and initial cheek varies throughout different regions. Register is extremely important when speaking, as it is an indicator of the formality of the conversation and the relationship between speakers. Saying vous shows formality and respect, whereas tu indicates familiarity or lower status. Courtesy in language is extremely important, even if it is just saying hello or goodbye when entering or leaving a place. Other ways to show courtesy are saying I would like instead of I want, and addressing others by madame or monsieur. In terms of punctuality, it is actually considered rude to be on time for an event or a meeting. The expectation is to arrive about 10 to 15 minutes later than the established time. While speaking, it is expected for individuals to behave discreetly and use quieter voices. And lastly, when being introduced to someone, it is important to call them madame or monsieur and wait to address them by their first name until that person says so. It is so important to keep all of these things in mind when going into the classroom, as it can drastically change the interactions with a student from a French background. There are many cultural differences that French speakers embody, so being conscious of all the norms can help you connect with the student, be more culturally responsive, and understand some of their difficulties with learning the second language. It is also critical to be mindful of the stereotypes, prejudices, and biases that may come into play because of these cultural differences. Shortness in conversation, being more private, or staying reserved in terms of physical touch should not be seen as rude or disrespectful.